All right, why don't we go ahead and get started? Thank you again to everybody who has made plans to attend this month's Thirsty Thursday, Energy Building Codes, the next steps for high-performing glass and facades. I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Thomas Culp. He's the owner of Birch Point Consulting, located in La Crosse, Wisconsin. After earning a PhD in chemical engineering from the University of Wisconsin, Dr. Culp has spent the last 20 years in the glass and window industry in the areas of energy efficient glazing and window performance, low-E coatings, and building code development. He is co-vice chair of the ASHRAE 90.1 Standards Committee and is an active participant in the International Code Council's code development hearing process. He is also involved in a variety of ways with ASHRAE 189.1, NFRC, the National Green Building Standard, Attachments Energy Rating Council, U.S. Department of Energy, and the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory and its Building America program. He currently represents the Aluminum Extruders Council, the National Glass Association, and its Glazing Industry Code Committee on Energy and Green Construction Codes. Tom, welcome.
All right, thank you. Hopefully you can hear me okay, and if not, please let me know, Sarah. Today, generally, I want to touch on like where are we at today in today's energy codes, what's out there right now, and then spend some time on future energy codes, specifically the 2021 IECC and ASHRAE 90.1 2019, and what that means for high performance glazing and facades. Many of you may have heard me touch on some of these details at previous presentations at BEC and other forums. So I'll try and go through that fairly quickly and focus on what's new with the IECC hearings. And then I also want to spend a little time towards the end talking about what's going on in New York City, all those recent headlines. There's some similar stuff going on in Washington State that you may or may not be aware of. And so I want to spend a little time talking about that at the end. But first, just to jump in, where are we at today with the energy codes? This is a very handy map. You can see the reference on the lower right. It's the Building Codes Assistance Program. There's a website there. It's a very good resource to know for any location you're at, what are they enforcing right now? And this is showing the map for the commercial energy code. And just 2 points. Number one, you can see it's a hodgepodge. It's all over the place where the different colors refer to different versions, in this case of ASHRAE 90.1. And so you have states, it takes, for different reasons, political and bureaucratic and so forth, different states go at different paces in terms of updating their codes. And so there's only a few places that are using the most recent code. California has their own thing, but it's kind of deemed equivalent of 2016 version, Nevada. But then don't be fooled, there are some specific locations like St. Louis, cities like that, New York City we'll talk about, and so forth, that have more updated codes. So the point is local codes may vary, and so this is a good resource. On the residential side, you see a very similar hodgepodge across the map. In this case, it's referring to the IECC, and it takes states a little while to bring up their codes up to date. So even though the latest code out there is 2018 IECC, not everywhere is there yet, but there are places working on it. And from a product standpoint, you want to be able to offer your product that meets the code wherever you serve. So really, most manufacturers try and meet or exceed the current code, regardless, even if you're in a location that's using an older code. So this is just a reference for you can look at later with all the numbers. You've probably seen this before. If you need to look up, hey, what are they using for the 2013 ASHRAE 90.1, gives you the values. But if you just take a piece, this highlights the numbers for the curtain wall and storefront values. And you can see as you go from older to newer, you see a steady increase in stringency, in this case, lowering of U factors. Not a big surprise. We all know that's happening. And we see that in the real market. As the codes advance and then are adopted by the states, the market adjusts too. And so this is historical Ducker data that was provided by AMA that shows for commercial and high-rise residential. On the left, we've seen a dramatic increase in the use of low-E glass. Great, that's what we want. We want to sell a higher value-added product, and we're seeing that in the marketplace. I think it's even higher than this. I'm a little surprised it shows 30% clear glass, but so the market data may be lagging a little bit. And then on the right side, the frame data shows by a dramatic increase in the use of thermally broken frames, which is good. That's what we want to see as the codes advance. So we see the codes advance, and then the market advances. Now, in contrast to that, the solar heat gain has stayed pretty consistent. You can see there it's always been at 0.25 in the south, and then higher solar heat gain in the central and north. There were some small revisions made in the center of the country, but really nothing too significant. So solar heat gain has been fairly stable over the last 10 years, and even, in fact, even going back before that. A few new changes coming up on that, which I'll talk about in a minute. On the residential side, we see a similar story where this shows the trend in U factors and solar heat gain. Well, first in U factor for residential, as the codes advance, the U factor is lower. And I also show the Energy Star line here because in the residential world, Energy Star is a key driver, really drives as much, if not more, than the code. And we've seen that ratchet further along. Solar heat gain, again, has been fairly stable other than a change between 2009 and 2012. It's been pretty much pointing at the 0.25 in the south. And so the market reflects both these U factors and solar heat gain. I don't have the Ducker charts, but generally we know, it's vinyl, wood, and fiberglass frames with low E glass pretty much everywhere and triple silver low E in the south. So just nothing too surprising. That's today's codes. Where I spend the bulk of my time and where I represent the industry and you guys is looking at future codes. What's coming down the road? What are we working on? What's being adopted? And then what'll hit the road 5 years, 10 years from now. I've talked at length before about ASHRAE 90.1. The 2019 version is pretty much done. All the content is done. And it will be published in early October. And then what is a little new is the 2021 IECC. Even though it's 2021, we're working on it this year. And so we went through the first public hearing this spring, where we went through 11 days of long days reviewing hundreds and hundreds of proposals, debating and then approving and disapproving and so forth. The next public hearing will be in October, and then there's a final online vote of all the code officials, building code officials, in kind of the November, December timeframe. And I'll talk a little bit more detail, but in general, kind of what came out of the IECC preliminary hearing results. Biggest item, which I'll show in a minute, is there was unanimous approval to align the commercial fenestration requirements between the IECC and ASHRAE 90.1. And likewise, along with that, was the committee disapproved other proposals that didn't do that, that went beyond, or there were some bad proposals like unrealistically applying residential window U factors to all commercial unit windows, regardless of structural performance or application. All those got shot down. So really we're trying to align 90.1 with IECC, which is a good thing from a implementation standpoint. On the residential side, I'll show you a couple numbers, really not many big changes from a fenestration standpoint, more debate on other issues. And then continued expansion of daylighting, focus on air leakage, new strong focus on renewable energy, and I'll talk about that. And then they, again, trying to align things, they now have aligned the climate zone maps so that they exactly match between IECC and ASHRAE 90.1. Last cycle, there were some subtle differences in some regions, but it made a difference where, for instance, Dallas was in one zone if you use the IECC, and a different zone if you use ASHRAE 90.1, which made no sense. So getting into a little more detail, commercial fenestration first. Like I said, the big deal was to try and align that ASHRAE 90.1 and the IECC. So I've spoken about 90.1 before. IECC is going to use the same thing, which is great. But in general, it's going to continue to push improved framing, warm edge spacers, argon gas fill, forced surface low E coatings, everything that's current available technology, but kind of pushing to using the more efficient technologies that are available while still being cost effective and practical. ASHRAE has to go through a big detailed analysis to prove a certain cost effectiveness. So that's where these numbers come from. And then very importantly, obviously, no reductions in window area. So that's very good news. In general, 5 to 17% reduction in U factors, some small changes in solar heat gain, which I'll show you. And in general, I like to tell people it's roughly a zone shift between the last code and this new coming code. So for instance, what was required in zone 7 will now be required in zone 6. What was required in zone 6 will move to zone 5, and so forth. So if you already have a product to serve a more northern zone, it'll just be making that same product, making it available in a further southern zone. And then one thing again with this alignment, and part of a big compromise deal, was to 90.1 IECC would use the same product categories without regard to frame material type. So this just visually shows you the U factors and solar heat gain, where you kind of see this next notch in performance in terms of U factor, and you'll have all these details later when we make the slides available. But it's just kind of just not a huge leap, but a significant and steady incremental improvement in all zones. This is the table showing the numbers. Again, you'll have this for later reference. But a lot of people have seen me present this before. I'm not going to go through it in length, but there's kind of a general formula or recipe you can use to meet these U factors in different zones. And people have told me this is handy. So zones 4 and 5. So that's Washington, D.C. is zone 4, and Chicago is zone 5. Generally, if you have low E, thermally broken frame, and then pick one thing off this list, obviously the most easy being argon, you'll meet the U factor. That's for 2016. And then as I mentioned, for 2019, ASHRAE 90.1, or what's going into the 2021 IECC, it's basically just moves everything. You add one more feature. So that same zone 4 to 5, now instead of picking one thing, you pick 2 things. And warm edge spacer is an option in that case too. So now Chicago, if you were just doing argon, low E, standard thermally broken frame, now maybe you're either going to add a high performance thermal break or a warm edge spacer or forced surface coating, but now you pick 2 things. So that's kind of what I mean by it's a zone shift, which stretches things, but in a realistic, practical manner. Now, solar heat gain, they did make a change, sort of, and I use that word for a reason. They are now going to include both in ASHRAE 90.1 and IECC separate solar heat gain numbers for fixed and operable products. And that's similar to what they already do for U factor. And they look different. So some people have been looking at like, oh, 0.23 solar heat gain in zones 2 and 3. Well, that's for the operable products. In reality, these numbers were set to use the exact same glazing type. So it's really the only difference is the fact that it's accounting for the higher frame to glass ratio in operable products. So when you get an NFRC type rating, you'll have the exact same glass, but your fixed lights that get a 0.25 will get a 0.23 in an operable window. So it's a way they can capture energy savings kind of on paper or in the performance path, but it doesn't actually require different glazing types in different zones. So there's really not big changes in solar heat gain coming, with the exception of zone 1, where they did lower it down to 0.23 fixed, 0.21 operable, and that will require these new lower triple silver products or a tint with a low E as an option. They wanted to do that last cycle. At that time, I think there's only one company offering them. Now there's multiple companies offering these products, and so they went ahead and made that change. Again, just to start off with zone 1 and zone 0, which is not even in the US, that's like Saudi Arabia and places like that, will use those. Zones 2 and 3 will still kind of be standard triple silvers, or you can go to the lower triple silvers, and then more standard products, but still solar control in the central and north. On the residential side, you know, there's a lot of debate, goes on for days, about a lot of different items, but not much on fenestration really. Most of it was a debate about performance space compliance paths, envelope backstops, which do involve windows. But when it comes down to the actual prescriptive requirements for fenestration, there are only small changes, which are shown here in blue. They made a few changes in the south, zones 2, 3, and 4 to U factor. And then they added a new footnote, which applies to anywhere there's a 3.0 U factor. They will allow up to a 3.2 U factor in windborne debris regions or at greater elevation, because if you have to put in a breather tube or so forth. All changes, proposed changes to solar heating were disapproved, so there are no changes made there. So really, it's not a big deal, with one exception. Highlighted there in yellow, we see in zone 2, the U factor went beyond Energy Star. Now it's a 0.35, so the products are readily available. So that's not an issue, but it's a conflict with the philosophy that Energy Star should be a notch above code, and that's been our philosophy, it's been EPA's philosophy, so it kind of creates a conflict. So GICC, AMA, and WDMA are all filing comments to at least rectify this, where Energy Code might match Energy Star in some places, like zones 3 and 4, but it wouldn't go beyond Energy Star, because we want to keep that kind of as a notch beyond. Other hot topics at the IECC hearings, air leakage and envelope commissioning. 90.1 has air leakage testing or air barrier inspection. IECC, the preliminary hearings went more aggressive. It's a pretty aggressive committee, and they passed to have both whole building air leakage testing and envelope commissioning in most occupancies. Now this is, think about every building type and commercial building type, from a small fast food restaurant up to a gigantic hotel or convention center. It's a big deal. So to do whole building testing and all those, some are easy, some are hard. And so it's going to be controversial. I don't know if it'll survive the rest of the process or not, or go back to the way ASHRAE has it, which is do testing or air barrier inspection. But either way, from our industry's viewpoint, especially the glazing contractors, you're going to see continued increased focus on air barrier continuity and the wall and window intersection. So they're going to be looking at those details more closely. Daylighting, we've worked over the last several code cycles to expand daylighting requirements. So we already have made a huge amount of progress there. And then they're taking additional steps as controls get better and with LED lighting. And so both 90.1 and IECC are going to require better controls, like continuous dimming, not just step controls, and more controls in more spaces. And what this really means for us, because a lot of it's about the controls, but the more controls you have, daylighting controls, and the better controls you have, that's more daylight savings, and it's more value from having windows. So it helps support having good glazing for views and health and occupancy and well-being, all those aspects, and daylighting. So it's generally very good for us. One new topic has been renewable energy. You know, it's not, you know, now, not just kind of as an add-on, but as a, hey, should we require on-site renewable energy? Most likely PV and BIPV, but could be other things as well. And 90.1 has an addendum to prescriptively require a minimum amount of on-site renewable energy, and we've been working, helping to promote that. But it's kind of did not quite make the timing, so will not be in the 2019. It's almost done, it's almost published, but it'll be after the 2019. A similar proposal was made to the IECC, but that one, there seems to be more controversy, and there's a difficult 2/3 vote coming up in the next fall hearing. So I think it's going to be pretty unlikely that that makes it into the 2021 IECC. But the IECC did approve incentives for renewable energy, including PV, and voluntary appendices for solar, PV, and net zero buildings that jurisdictions can pick it up. And so it's hard to put on paper of just how much emphasis there was on this, not just in California, not just in the Southwest, but across the country. So I think we're going to continue to see this focus on PV as part of the building solution. So for glass manufacturers involved in that market, it's coming, and not just relying on government incentives. Finally, thermal bridging. I've reported before, 90.1 has this big proposal trying to limit thermal bridges in the opaque areas, but that does include the lineup or the interface at the wall and the window. So it's not talking about the window itself, but more about window installation and how it fits into and lines up with the wall insulation. It's a big issue because you're getting into detailing, but it's not ready. It's not even close to being ready. So it will not be in the 2019, and it will not be in the IECC, but they are still working on it. And that's a whole topic on its own that we could do a whole nother presentation on. But I did want to spend a few minutes talking about what's going on in New York City and then Washington State, because I know it was a real, a couple months ago, late April, there are all these headlines coming out of New York City from the mayor. And some of them are shown there, ban glass skyscrapers and glass skyscrapers have no place on our earth, and it creates this big tumult in the trade press, and everyone's asking what's going on. And then I'll talk about Washington State. Didn't have all that big rhetoric, but there's something similar going on there. I guess the message I want to send is just everyone take a chill pill, relax. There are some concerns there. That's the threat that everyone's identified right away, but there's also really big opportunities coming out of this. So I want to talk a little bit about what's actually happening in New York City and Washington State and so forth. But before I get into the details, I wanted to point out, where did some of this come from? It's kind of interesting when you take a step back. It really comes back to politics in early 2017 when the U.S. administration announced their intention to leave the Paris Climate Accords. All right, you may say that has nothing to do with windows and glazing, but it does, because when if you remember, when the current administration pulled out or announced their intention to pull out of the Paris Climate Accords, there was a big rally from individual cities and states, not just California, but a lot of places, saying, all right, well, we're going to act locally on our own. And now we're starting to see that in the building codes. And so that's where some of this is coming from. They're doing this as part of, all right, well, we're going to fulfill our commitment as an individual level, whether it's New York City or Washington State, but at the local level. And so it's somewhat chaotic. It's going to make it a little harder for our industry and for people like me because it's going to be different all over the place, regional being versus national. But it is an opportunity as well. So New York City. So again, it's poor rhetoric. I really hate how it was presented, and I actually spoke with the director of the mayor's sustainability office. She's involved in the IECC process, and I said, this is not helpful. Don't make this about glass. Make it about energy performance. But of course, politics is politics. So it is a threat to highly glazed buildings, and it ignores the contribution of high performance glazing to energy efficiency and daylighting and occupant health and well-being. And I tried to make the point to her that the focus should be on poor performing facades and value engineering, where we offer great products and then someone pulls it out. But it should not be on window area. It's like, yes, you can do that highly glazed building if you do it right. So this kind of leads to the opportunity number one, which is in new buildings, promote high performance facades. We have the products: advanced framing with wide thermal breaks, glazing with multiple layers of low E coatings, shading systems. There's all sorts of things we have that are not being installed or being value engineered out. And when you look at the actual details, the new stretch code that is now going to be required in New York City does not ban glass. There's nothing that bans glass, reduces window area. It just sets another step in the energy performance. And the numbers are 3.6 U factor and 3.6 solar heat gain for fixed products, curtain wall, storefront, so forth. That's not that hard. That's a thermally broken frame, low E, argon, warm edge spacer, all available technology. So, I mean, yes, it's going to make you use all those things, but it's not that difficult. And then the other piece that is a little been concerning to us, they have an envelope backstop saying that no matter what, if you put in high efficiency lighting and mechanical equipment, your envelope can be no worse than X. But when you look at the actual math to get there, it still allows up to 70% window to wall ratio and 30% spandrel. So that's an all glass building with a U factor of 3.6 and solar heat gain of 3.6 in the performance path. You still have to use high efficiency lighting and equipment, but you can do that. And you can go all the way up to maybe 90% window to wall ratio with good orientation and higher performance windows. So it's not banning all glass buildings. It's just saying you have to do a very good facade. And that's what we want people to do anyways. And the other point people forget, kind of leads to the second opportunity, is the second you build a new building, it's an existing building. So as soon as we think about new construction, existing building is different. In existing building, we think about like 1980s and old stuff. But the second you have your occupancy permit, that new building now falls under the rules for existing buildings. And there are new existing building limits as part of this deal coming up in New York City that I'll show on the next slide. And that's going to help reduce short-term value engineering on, when people say, all right, I don't want that thermal breaker. Let's take out the argon or the warm edge spacer. This is going to force them to think about not just the new building code compliance, but, how does it perform down the road? Because I'm going to have to pay fines if it does not perform well. So that leads to the second opportunity. What they have written down for existing buildings is going to be a strong opportunity for retrofit, replacing, and even adding glazing, secondary glazing. So there's an overall target. They're doing this for climate reasons. Like I mentioned before, it's reduce the city's carbon emissions by 40% by 2030. And they're establishing targets they have an office that will establish targets by 2023 for existing buildings over 25,000 square feet, excluding low-rise residential and a few other types of buildings. So then starting 2024, building owners must report their energy usage annually and then pay fines, basically a carbon tax, for exceeding those limits or not reporting. And they're significant, they're big. And they're trying to focus on first in 2024, set limits that get the 20% worst carbon intensive buildings or highest carbon intensive buildings. And then in 2030, set it to cover 75% of the buildings. So what's that mean for us? It's a very large incentive to upgrade existing buildings, because the easiest competitor to doing something in a building is doing nothing. And now this will suddenly change that. These fines, it is a tax, but it will improve the economics, the ROI on doing envelope retrofits. And so that means glazing and window replacement. It also means secondary glazing systems that are out there. So it could be a big opportunity for us. And then part of it, there's also an option to purchase renewable energy credits as a way of satisfying this. So that supports our members who also play in the PV and BIPV world. And then lastly, real quick, I just want to talk about Washington State. This has made the news less, but there was a law that was passed there recently, and it's very similar, and it's based on similar climate change goals and same reasons. When the U.S. as a nation pulled out, a lot of places, including Washington State, said, fine, we're going to do it. They passed a new law, HB 1257, and it sets aggressive targets for reducing building energy use. The only difference is they're focusing on energy instead of carbon, even though they are doing it based on climate change goals. For new buildings, it's a pretty aggressive target, and it's not just a goal, it's a required target for their building codes. By 2031, reduce energy use by 70%. Right now, the number's not that hard. U of 0.38, solar heat gain 0.38, that's not difficult. But we will have to watch it, because between now and 2031, they could really make big changes. They do have an envelope backstop that's a little more stringent than New York City, which I don't like, but it is what it is. With daylighting, it allows you up to 51% window to wall ratio in the performance path with the current product, and up to about 70% window to wall ratio if you go down to a very good product, 0.29. So it's a little tighter than New York City, but there's still opportunities there, and it's the opportunity to push high performance glass. And then existing buildings, same thing as New York. Except they're doing energy limits instead of carbon limits, but the idea is to impose fines for exceeding energy use limits. And then the flip side is they're going to use some of that fine money to provide incentives, credits. If you go beyond target, they'll actually give you a rebate. So there's money on the table both directions. And you can see the schedule there, starting with big buildings in 2026, going down to all buildings over 50,000 square feet in 2028. So again, similar to New York, there's a threat to window area that we need to watch carefully, but it's an opportunity, and I think our response has to be push high performance systems and retrofits. Don't let them get away with value engineering where possible, or if there is, try and, obviously we want everything to be economic, but make them think long-term when they're looking at the economics, not just at first costs. So I'll just wrap up with a quote I found kind of interesting from Robert Kennedy. There's a curse which says, may you live in interesting times. And like it or not, we live in interesting times. They are times of danger and uncertainty, but they are also the most creative of any time in the history of mankind. this is from 53 years ago, but I think it still applies in many ways today, so I found that kind of applicable. So with that, I'll real quick note from NGA staff that to take a note here at the registration is open for glass build. And then we also have the fall conference coming up in Toledo in August, where we're going to have a lot of the old guards, the glass old guard there, and that the registration is also open. If there's anything else you wanted to say about those?
Great. No, I appreciate you taking a moment to give them both acknowledgement, and registration is, like you said, open for both. So information on the agendas are available online as well, or you can feel free to reach out to me or any other staff if you have specific questions. But I want to open it up for questions to Tom. For the sake of everybody's different audio situations, we found the chat function to be a better means to address questions. So feel free to use the chat button that should be at the bottom of your webinar screen to enter your questions. We'll give you a minute to do that and address whatever you're interested in.
My contact information is on the screen, and so please feel free to email me as well if you have other questions or.
Okay. Well, see, we haven't received any questions yet or comments, so please do take note of Tom's email, as he said. Thank you all for making plans to attend, and Tom, thank you for speaking. Our next webinar is August 22nd, and we'll be discussing design considerations for multi-cavity glazing. Oh, sorry, one more. Oh, yes, thank you very much for attending. Have a great afternoon.
All right, thank you.